Good afternoon, Uzoma. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Okay, it is just about 2 p.m. We've got a little bit of a smaller audience to get started, but you'll see that people will be coming in and out most likely. As I mentioned in the telephone call, we will begin with a brief introduction. We'll give you some time to present your ideas, and then we'll have a discussion between you and I, and then we'll open up to our audience
Sure.
to see what they think and allow them to ask you some questions as well.
Great.
Okay. All right, so let's get started. Good afternoon, friends of the Green Room in the Green Institute. Thank you very much for visiting us today for our episode of the Green Room, featuring a member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly in Canada, Uzoma Asagwara. Uzoma, excuse me one second. Uzoma is a registered psychiatric nurse. Her specialty is addictions, and she's also a former member of the Canadian national basketball team. In 2019, they made history as the first Black, queer, gender non-conforming person elected to the Manitoba Legislative Assembly and across Canada. Most recently, Uzoma became the first Black person to make a law in Manitoba where their bill, the Somali Heritage Week Act, was passed in December 2020 with unanimous support in the Manitoba legislature. Uzoma has been a longtime advocate along newcomers and refugee communities, Two-Spirit, LGBTQ+ folks, youth, and grassroots organizations. Friends of the Green Room, please welcome Uzoma Asagwara to our discussion today. Today, we're going to be talking about how self-actualization promotes sustainable development. So without any ado, I'd like to ask Uzoma Asagwara to address our audience. Welcome to our program.
Yeah, happy to be here. Dr. McSparron, happy to see you, meet you in person this way.
Yes, please call me Jason. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so I'm thrilled at the opportunity to talk about this subject. It's interesting because it's something I actually hadn't thought about formally, really, to be honest with you, in this way, until the opportunity presented itself to talk about it in this manner. So I'm happy to be able to talk a little bit about my own experience and contextualize sort of what I see self-actualization in terms of sustainability to be, and how I've navigated that on my own journey. So Jason did already touch on the fact that my background is as a psychiatric nurse and a former member of the Canadian national basketball team. I was an addiction specialist as well. I've only been an elected official since the fall of 2019. But certainly my journey has been fairly dynamic, and it's been that as a result of some intentional, although I didn't know it in the beginning, some intentional steps that I was taking to move myself in a direction that for me was really about being the best version of myself possible, being the most true version of myself possible, and figuring out a way to do those things in a manner that is in fact sustainable. So I think I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Just so I can share a few slides. And if you
Could our friends at the Green Institute please make Uzoma the host so that she may share her screen?
And just a reminder, Jason, I do use neutral pronouns, so they, them pronouns for me.
Excuse me, I do apologize for that mistake.
No worries.
Yes.
No worries. All right. I'll try that again. Not disabled yet. So I'm just going to get into it then. I can just talk about it. There,
Certainly.
it's my screen. I'm not like a fancy, PowerPointer. It's literally just slides with some words on it, so no big deal. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is that basically for me, when I think about self-actualization, there's really a few key components that have helped me sort of frame the journey that I've been on, and that helped me frame this kind of conversation, because I've actually been having this conversation for a number of years now with different communities, different community members, organizations, businesses, and certainly within the political landscape, this does come up. So the first thing that I think about when it comes to this is autonomy, and the importance of autonomy, and what that even means to us as individuals. And to me, I think back to when I was done playing basketball. I spent most of my life being an elite athlete, from a young person, playing every sport I possibly could, and being identified as somebody who was really exceptionally good at sports at a young age. And so when I retired from playing basketball and was transitioning into my professional career as a healthcare provider, I had to deal with a huge loss of identity. I had to navigate no longer being that person who was the star athlete, or always away from home because they were in this part of the world or that part of the world competing. And I had to resign myself in a way to being, in my own mind, is oddly like a regular person. I was like, oh, so people aren't going to be taking care of my life in this way. Like, you train every day as hard as you can, full time, working toward this goal of going to the Olympics. And that affords you really opportunities that I certainly wouldn't have had otherwise. And so the thought of, going to work every single day, doing something that I love as a nurse, but also navigating sort of not having the experience of being on those larger platforms, or the experience of being a part of something that felt so much bigger than me as an individual. And what it forced me to do was to figure out who I was outside of being an athlete. And I realized in that part of my journey, in that part of my life, I really didn't know who that was. And what that opportunity allowed me to do was to explore aspects of my identities that I had neglected for many years, aspects of who I am that I had never invested in, I had never reflected on, simply because I was able to immerse myself in being this one thing and rooting my identity in something that was, for me, exciting and felt really positive and pushed me to the limits of my physical and mental abilities as an athlete. And so it was in that stage of my life, starting this new nursing career, letting go of my prior big part of my identity as an athlete, that I started to reflect on different aspects of my identity. Who do I want to be as a healthcare provider? Who do I want to be as a sibling who's now living in Manitoba full time, not traveling, not leaving for months at a time to go train someplace else? Who did I want to be in our communities? Who was I even as somebody, navigating the world as a young adult? And one of the things that really came up for me was my identity around being queer. That was something that I essentially had, I don't want to say I had neglected, but I really had. It was actually something that at that point in my life, I was kind of ashamed of. There was some internalized shame, there was fear, there was confusion, there was a lack of self-understanding around that, because that had been an area of my life that, I hadn't really had space to navigate relationships, to talk to people about this safely, and community at all, to sort of be embraced as who I was in that identity. And so that was where a lot of the deep work began, and recognizing that for me, my autonomy was rooted in a commitment to being my true self. My autonomy had to be about centering my needs, my understanding of self, and committing to understanding myself for who I was to direct my life. And so the other part of that commitment had to also be like a radical commitment to honesty. you know, a radical commitment to understanding myself, unpacking all of the things that had been packed into me as a person throughout my life,
Mhm.
and making a commitment in that radical honesty to learn about myself and learn to love myself for all of who I was. I had to commit as well to learning and unlearning so much of what we're boxed into. And so the next big sort of category for me in terms of self-actualization is unlearning and learning. You know, the learning part is really being truthful about who you are, what you like, what your interests are, what your relationships look like, what your friendships look like, what serves you, what doesn't serve you, how you want to serve in the world, and unlearning all of the things that contextualize us that maybe actually aren't even ours. And so for me, the unlearning, the learning was really about learning about queer identity. The learning was learning about what it means to be Black, what it means to be first generation, what it means to be a part of the diaspora, what it means to be all of these identities working in a healthcare system that often perpetuates harms against the very communities that I belong to and that I'm a part of. And learning, you know, who I am in all of those spaces and places and identities, and how I truly want to be as I walk in this world, and unlearning all of the ways in which we are taught to construct ourselves to fit into boxes that are prescribed and ascribed to us. And so, you know, an example that I can give would be, you know, unlearning what it means to identify a certain way in terms of gender. You know, I've known since I was as small as I can remember that I'm a gender non-conforming person. I've known that since I was a kid. I didn't have the language for it. I never saw anybody with those experiences on television or read about them in books. I had no role model and no example, but I knew from as long as I can remember that the gender identity ascribed to me, that being girl and she, didn't make any sense. I actually really believed as a kid growing up that one day I would just become a boy. I was like, this doesn't make sense. Somebody messed up here, and that's okay, because in my little kid brain, I was like, it probably just corrects itself at some point, right? And I'll just feel comfortable at some point. You know, and as you get older, for me anyway, I learned that I had to fit into a box. And, you know, my mom and I have actually talked about it. We can talk about it in a really good, loving way now. But she often says, you know, she's like, I didn't understand a lot of some of your resistance as a kid to certain things. You know, I didn't understand why you resisted so much wearing certain clothes, why you resisted so much being in certain spaces. And she couldn't have, right? Because she also didn't have the language, and she also didn't have the experience and the information and any visual sort of representation of what, you know, her kid was going through and what they were resisting, right? And so it was for me doing the work of unlearning all of the boxes that I had been told my whole life I needed to fit in order to fit. And that's really hard work. And it's really challenging work because there's so much we're just conditioned to that is an automatic response. We don't even think about it. It just comes up naturally. And so to me, that's a huge part of the process of self-actualization, is not just the learning, but the unlearning and the work that goes hand in hand with that. And there's some really great folks that, you know, that I can look to now, you know, because we've got all these platforms that we can access on social media as a good example, as folks who do some of that unpacking for us. And I know, Jason, when you and I spoke before today, I mentioned Alok, Jesus, I'm blocking on their last name, I apologize, Alok. And they are just an outstanding artist. They're brilliant. They give so much of themselves and deconstruct and unpack so much of what we all navigate in this world and give people permission to ask questions and permission to sort of pull back the barriers that are in the way of us getting to where we want to be in terms of who we are. And the next part for me is something that I learned definitely as an athlete and learned as somebody who, you know, you're taught if you want to get someplace, you got to set goals and you should dream big and aim high and all of those metaphors. But the next big component is just the journey, right? It's recognizing that it's a process and that whatever it is your goals are or your vision or your dream, you have to be able to be present in the process and recognize the gift of the journey, that it should be something that you can enjoy, not all of it for sure, absolutely, but you know, it's a process, it's a journey that if you really pay attention, if you commit to being present throughout it, you might be surprised at some of what you experience on that journey that you wouldn't have otherwise if you didn't have a big dream and a big goal, and if you weren't being present throughout it, that actually might be more valuable to you than what you were pursuing kind of out of the onset. And when I think about what that means in my life, I think about the fact that, you know, my whole life I dreamed about being a superstar basketball player, right? So I'm a little kid, I'm watching the NBA, I'm convinced I'm gonna play with Michael Jordan. Like I'm convinced he and I are gonna be on the same team, I'm gonna make it to the NBA, that's my dream. And then the WNBA comes along, you know? Okay, dreams gotta change. WNBA is probably the league that I'm gonna have to shoot for, that's cool. That became my dream. And, you know, as I'm pursuing that dream and as I'm pursuing this big goal, what ends up happening along this journey is I actually get the opportunity to be on the Canadian national basketball team. At no point in my childhood did I ever think about the Canadian national basketball team. I actually knew very little about them. And, you know, it was because I was pursuing this big goal, this one dream, that along the way, these opportunities started presenting themselves. And they were opportunities that I was open to because I was really present. And it didn't happen in one go. You know, the first time I actually tried out for the national team, I wasn't sure I was even going to go, but I thought, you know what, this is an opportunity put before me and I've been working really hard and I should maybe pursue this path. First time I tried out, didn't make the team. Was actually told that I should probably pursue a different path, like maybe playing internationally, that maybe the national team just wouldn't be a good fit for someone like myself. And I don't like being told I can't do things, first of all. So that was a blessing and a curse in that moment. But you know, it stayed with me. I put my head down. I worked even harder. My training became totally next level. I invested in myself as an athlete in a way that I never had before. And I didn't even realize I hadn't been until in that moment, someone looked at me and told me that maybe I couldn't do the thing that I was there to try and do. And then eventually, like in my next opportunity, I went back and I did make the team. And, you know, I never made it to the WNBA, but you know, my experience with the national team, which really hadn't been on my radar, was one of the best experiences of my entire life. It changed me as a person. It exposed me to different parts of the world I never would have seen otherwise. And, you know, as a result, I've got these lifelong, beautiful relationships and experiences that have helped me on my path, even in politics to this day. And so enjoy the journey, embrace the journey, and be present throughout the journey, because you never know what's going to come from that. And don't minimize the importance of it, you know, whatever your goals and your big dreams might be. And then the last really big component, in my mind anyway, in terms of self-actualization, is contributing. It's contribution. So to me, it's so important for us to respect and to appreciate that we are not existing in a vacuum as individuals, right? We're not actually solitary beings, as introverted and as As much as some folks might like isolation, I love solitude. I love my own time. I spend a lot of time by myself and I enjoy it. I like myself enough to really love hanging out with myself. But you know, it's incumbent on us, and I feel a level of responsibility to contribute to other people having a better quality of life, to other people enjoying their own journeys in as much as they possibly can. And I think that the more we do those other things, the more that we understand the importance of autonomy and learning and unlearning, and we respect the journey and we're present in the journey and enjoy that process, the more likely we are to want to contribute to our communities being better. And that's a really invaluable way to actually enhance the areas of ourselves that we're committing to and investing in order to achieve, you know, a level of self-actualization. It's a part of being able to see your learnings reflected in other people and in the journeys of other people and in other spaces, and trying to be a problem solver and contributing to the answers that our communities need and that our neighbors and loved ones need, and versus being a part of the problem.
Mhm.
And you know, the thing that really struck me is that my whole life, and I can't overstate it, my whole life changed when I committed to being exactly who I am, learning myself, learning who I am, and learning to love who I am. My whole life changed. My relationships changed. My opportunities changed. The ways in which I wanted to contribute to community changed. I became a community organizer and an activist, and really saw the value and the importance and the transformative effect of what happens when you commit to not only those things for yourself, but when you share that with the world, the ways in which that gives other people permission to express themselves authentically, and ultimately how that benefits us collectively, right? When we're not hiding ourselves from one another, when we know that we can be seen and appreciated as whole people. And you know, that's something for me that has been probably one of the greatest lessons of my life to this point anyway, is the value and the return on that investment you make in yourself and in your life when you contribute that to community, what that means and what that can look like, the impact it can have positively. So, you know, at the end of the day, sustaining all of that takes work, it takes practice, it takes missteps, it takes, you know, hard times, but it's worth it. You know, it's not something that happens overnight, and I don't think that it's something you would want to happen. Actually, it's not true. We probably all want it to happen overnight, but you know, it takes time, and sustaining that takes commitment, and it takes, like I said, practice. It takes practice, and it's worth it. It's totally worth it. And it becomes much more sustainable when all of those areas are being addressed in a genuine way, and it just becomes, you know, a part of your day-to-day life. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, Jason, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Okay.
Certainly. Uzoma, thank you very much for sharing your story. It was very interesting. Before we move on, I just kind of want to build a little bit of context for our audience.
Sure.
Again, we're talking about self-actualization and how it can promote sustainable development. And again, just a little bit on the background of self-actualization. It's the idea comes from the renowned psychiatrist Abraham Maslow, right? And he talked about this in his theory of human motivation. Maslow has hypothesized that satisfying needs drive human behavior. Needs like food and water and safety need to be met first. Then we strive to achieve social connections, things along about ourselves like self-esteem. So once all of those goals are met, we move on to seeking what he termed the idea of self-actualization, which in essence is achieving our full potential. And as Uzoma has been talking about, there are links which she has been saying, Ian, to these 4 characteristics of the process of becoming self-actualized. So again, Maslow talks about you have to cultivate an openness to experience. You have to reflect on your values. You have to move beyond love and esteem needs and look at your own self-esteem. And then you also have to live authentically. So in the last few minutes, we can hear that Uzoma has been expounding on these very principles, talking about how in her own experience, she felt that she had to be autonomous, right?
Sorry,
And she
Jason,
had to,
just gonna jump in. They,
please,
them.
and again, I apologize, they, yes, they.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, they had spoken in talking about autonomy, being true to the self, right? In being honest with the self, how you feel inside, how you act, and how you approach others and interact in the world. The idea of learning and unlearning is, again, another really interesting term Uzoma has been, concepts that Uzoma has been talking about. And again, this goes along the ideas Maslow was talking about in terms of moving beyond love and esteem and living your authentic life. And then they also mentioned that you have to enjoy the journey and identify how and how best you may contribute to society and to the self-actualization that you see for yourself as a person, an individual. So again, Uzoma, I really appreciate you bringing this concept to the green room and getting us to start to talk about this. I was wondering if you could, you started to talk about it, but I was wondering if you could expound on it just a little bit more and talk about how this concept and this practice of self-actualization can translate into sustainable development, either in the individual life, which I think you've been focusing on, but how about a little bit more for, say, community?
Sure.
Yes, please.
Sure. So, it's interesting because, as I mentioned, I was a healthcare provider before going into politics, and I was also a community organizer and an activist.
Yes.
And when I started to really lean into those, I guess, and I didn't know it, like I said, the core principles around self-actualization, I started to also really appreciate and understand how important that is to other communities and to individuals who are accessing healthcare and to policy development, right? So when you have an understanding of what it means to do that work as an individual, and you can enhance that and sort of expand that in relation to communities. And when we can look at the fact that there are communities that are disproportionately impacted by policy, by systems, then you can start to realize the importance of those principles in terms of the systems that we navigate. And so, it's incumbent, and I talked about responsibility before. I feel a tremendous amount of responsibility as a legislator to recognize that not everybody is working from the same place of resource, personally or otherwise. And so then how do I, in my capacity previously as a nurse, previously as an organizer, how do I contribute to individuals, to families, to communities, having the capacity and the resource they deserve to have those experiences, right?
Yes.
To be able to self-actualize. And how do you do that in a way that is sustainable? And fundamentally, people do need to have their basic needs met. If people's basic needs aren't met, they can't do the work of self-actualization. If people's basic needs aren't met and they're simply focused on surviving, there's a lot of other opportunity, there's a lot of other experiences that they just can't connect with because they're focused on staying alive. And we see that in our communities. And we see how, in fact, policies and structures can perpetuate that reality that many folks face of simply being focused on surviving versus moving beyond that and thriving. And so, there's a significant amount of responsibility to be somebody who's a part of the solution in terms of making sure that the policies we're putting forward, the laws that are being passed, the ways in which we are, as we evolve here, building onto and building away from these systems, that it is sustainable for everyone, right? That we're giving everyone the best opportunities long term to have good outcomes. And I mean, there's a lot that you can do in the short term to try and get small bursts of results that you desire. But it's not about me. It's not about, our individual needs. We have to be able to look at the collective and understand how we actually make decisions that are sustainable, long-term, and positive for those folks who unfortunately haven't had an equal or equitable chance at that.
Excellent. Okay. Really good answer. I appreciate that very much. So again, looking at that linkage between self-actualization and sustainable development. And it's this idea that once we realize what it is that each individual wants to do, there really needs to be that space. And I think what you're saying is that as a politician, you have to look at the laws and the policies and the structures and try and do what can be done in order to create that space for people to be their authentic selves and pursue their authentic pursuits, right?
Absolutely.
Really appreciate that.
It just makes for better communities, right? It just makes for,
Yes.
like, again, at the foundation of it, we have to make sure people have what they need in order to have the capacity and the space to pursue the rest, to actualize the rest. And it's like, that's the space we want people to be able to navigate the world from, right? That's better. That's the best thing for all of us. If we've got folks who are working from that space, like, I think about what I was able to achieve and what I've been able to do, and people that, I look at who've been able to achieve and what they've been able to do because they have the capacity to do so. Like, I want everybody to have that opportunity, but it takes intention to make sure that people do have those opportunities.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Okay, at this point, Uzoma, what I'd like to do is I'd like to look to our audience to see if anyone has any questions for you. And
Sure.
I see that Khalid Nassif has a question up for you. So I'm going to I'm going to read his question
Okay.
because I do not have access to unmute him and allow him to ask himself.
Okay.
But Khalid wants to know, how is it possible to achieve the goals of personal and societal development in light of the existence of racist policies and discriminatory policies imposed by the occupying state?
That's a great question. And I apologize because I actually didn't situate myself when we started. I'm here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, right? So the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, OG Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and homeland of the Métis Nation. And something that we have to face just head on is the fact that we are navigating systems that are rooted in racist and discriminatory policies and practices. And I say that as somebody, who worked in a healthcare system, that we know systemic racism is a problem within. We know that. And folks who try to deny that or minimize that are not helping anything. It's incredibly important, especially for political leaders, to be able to identify that as a reality, because if we don't face it, we can't fix it, right? And so, part of the work that is upon us is in our own capacity. And I'll go back to that learn and unlearn. A lot of people don't actually understand or know how systemic racism and discrimination functions. What does that actually mean within the context of any given system? What does that mean in terms of policy development? What does that mean in terms of access to opportunity or lack of access to opportunity? We have to be able to articulate that, to teach that, to share that with people in a way that is accessible and that is meaningful, so that it's one thing to learn it. It's another thing for it to reside with you, for there to be residual that you can apply to the ways you interact with the world. If you're someone like me, a non-Indigenous person who does not experience anti-Indigenous racism living here in Manitoba, I am not going to understand it the same way an Indigenous person who lives it will. It's not
Certainly.
possible. But I do have to learn it. I have to make every effort to understand it to the best of my ability, and also learn how it functions in our society so that I can actively be a part of dismantling that, actively be a part of ensuring that we're moving in a direction of true equality and truly being anti-racist
Yes.
in the work that I'm doing. And so, when I apply that way of thinking, to the learning part of it, we have to really make sure that people can learn it in a way that is meaningful for them and apply it to the ways in which they navigate the world. And then the unlearning is also a big part of this in terms of unlearning the ways in which, unlearning the teachings and the lessons that we've been taught throughout our whole lives that perpetuate these racist and discriminatory policies. And that's something that has to be a commitment at every level. It's not something that just I can commit to. It's something that all legislators have to be aware of and commit to. It's something that teachers have to commit to and be aware of. It's something that business owners have to commit to and be aware of. It's something that academics have to commit to and be aware of. So it's a whole of society approach, and it takes time. But there are certainly some key areas and key people and leaders who need to make sure that they're doing this work and that they're committed to it, because folks on a grassroots level have been doing this work for hundreds of years, forever, right? And what they need are for folks in positions of power and authority or privilege, or however you want to construct it or articulate it. What those folks need is for people in those positions, those decision-making positions, to get on board and start doing their fair share of the heavy lifting.
Excellent. Right. Great. I'd just like to mention to the audience, if anyone has a question, please hit the raise your hand button, and we'll have somebody from the green room unmute you so that you can ask your question, or you can just type your question into the chat, and then I could ask Uzoma for you. Okay, so if anyone has a question, please pose that. I just want to say that, again, Uzoma, I really appreciate the comments that you're stating. I appreciate where you're coming from. I think it's powerful to say that we really have to understand and look at the structures and how the existing structures either create space and opportunity for some people while minimizing space and minimizing opportunity for other people. And the way that, self-actualization works within that on the individual level, but also more broadly on the societal level.
Yeah.
As I'm waiting for any other questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you a little bit about maybe your political platform, and
Sure.
ask, what are some of the goals that you've set for yourself in the role as a legislative assembly member?
I appreciate that question, Jason, very much. My goal first and foremost is to be a good representative. I represent almost 22,000 people in a constituency that's in the core of our downtown city. And it's important for me for people to get to know me and to know that I work for them, right? Like I work for them. I'm employed by the people, for the people. And so it's so important for folks to understand what I do in terms of my job, what we can do to support them, what we can do to help advocate for them, and for people to really understand and know that our job, my job, is to make sure that their voices and concerns and needs are heard in the Manitoba legislature. And it's interesting because I was elected, like I said, in the fall of 2019, and that was a historic election in Manitoba in that I was one of the first 3 Black people ever elected to represent this level of government, which is wild when you think about it. Like in 2019, it took that long. But it's also reflective of the barriers that still exist for all of our communities to be equitably represented in government. And part of my responsibility is making sure that people who have not had their needs heard the same way or been centered in policy making, that those folks are really heard in that building that I work in. And that they have the opportunity in our Manitoba Parliament to know that somebody understands them maybe in a unique way and is
Right.
fighting for them. So, at the end of the day, doing that work benefits everyone. I represent everybody, regardless if they voted for me or not. And I'm happy to, I want to be somebody who contributes to our society being the best that it can for everyone to have a shot at having a happy, healthy life. And that's a privilege. It's a tremendous privilege to be in this role. My background being healthcare certainly has contributed positively to my experience, and I think my skill set in being in opposition in terms of government. I'm the critic for health, and I want to make sure that healthcare is the best it can possibly be. It needs to improve. It needs to become more fair, more accessible, more efficient, and I'm committed to that.
Really appreciate that. It's really nice to hear you speak. You're talking about you want to represent not only the people who voted for you, but the entire community. It's really nice to see that, in your authentic, in your proponent, in your expectations for the society, and not just one or two groups of people, specialty groups, etc. So it's really good to see that you're looking to create more equity in the society, and that's something that all societies would benefit from.
For sure.
Let me see. Are there any questions from our audience? At this point, I'll give anyone a chance to raise their hand.
I see a question about, I think, from in the chat.
In the chat, yes. My chat just closed on me. And the chat question is, yes, here we are. In the light of the increasing refugee situation in the world, should their assistance be carried out in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda? How could this be achieved? And again, this is from Khalid Nassif as well. So again, a really big issue.
Yeah, it's a huge issue. It's a good question, though. It's a really, really good question. I mean, fundamentally, it's so important, I believe, and I know for us to create safety and true inclusion for refugees, and to ensure that when refugees, arrive and come to our province, to our city, to our country, that they are met with the adequate resource and support to, again, go from that potentially survival mode to being able to thrive. You want to close that gap as quickly as possible. A lot of folks, a lot of refugees are coming from an experience of trauma. A lot of refugees, and I've had the privilege of, in my community work as an organizer before politics, doing a lot of work alongside refugee communities and newcomer communities, and recognizing that we have to do a good job, a better job of ensuring that there's enough resource in place for folks to, like I said, close that gap and allow folks the opportunity to thrive as quickly as possible. And in that, it requires a lot of understanding, and understanding what it means to be culturally appropriate and relevant. And I do believe that that can be carried out absolutely in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda. Refugees contribute immensely, immeasurably to our society, culturally, economically, and otherwise, politically. And so the landscape that we have is better by adequately and appropriately serving refugee communities. And absolutely, I believe that the Sustainable Development Project is better served when we're doing that work concurrently and in a meaningful way.
Fantastic. Okay. Other questions? Let's see. Not quite. Okay, so I've got a question for you.
Sure.
I saw that in 2014, you founded the Queer People of Color Winnipeg Initiative, which creates safer spaces and increases the visibility and representation of queer and transgender people of color. I was wondering, how does this initiative meet its goals? I'm really interested in how civil society works with government in its role and how they work together. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that initiative and how it accomplishes the goals that it set out.
Sure. So when we started that collective back in 2014, it came from a place of recognizing that we could either keep begging and pleading for broader society, for non-Black and Indigenous and people of color who are on that LGBTQ spectrum, to do the work of making spaces safer for those identified communities, being more inclusive. We could beg and plead and fight for that, and we continue to do that work, but we could also create those spaces ourselves. We could also create platforms and build awareness and create an inclusive and safer initiative ourselves. And so that's what we did. And, it's interesting because in the beginning, there was a ton of resistance. People didn't want to talk about that racism existing within communities that are already marginalized. People didn't want to talk about the ways in which different kinds of discrimination manifest and how they function. Tough conversations to have.
Right.
But, the inevitability of what we were doing was that we weren't the only ones, a small little collective of a few people, we weren't the only ones having those experiences and wanting and desiring those safe spaces and dialogue. And so very quickly, it became something that resonated with people. Very quickly, it became something that we were able to talk to business owners about, and organizations about, and schools about, and students about, and families, people in community, refugees who were looking for people and spaces to connect with and talk about these things. And ultimately, what ends up happening is you push this dialogue because it's important, and it benefits the broader society. It just does. You've got people who then have language for things. You've got people who are now paying attention to issues that they weren't paying attention to before, or that they didn't feel they had the capacity to navigate respectfully or with awareness and understanding. And maybe they had all the compassion in the world, but they didn't have those other things to go hand in hand with it, so they could action their compassion responsibly. And so, over the years, it's been incredible to see organizations and businesses and policies at different levels of government start to reflect the values that we were, advocating around those years ago, and to also see, other groups and other organizations and individuals pushing that dialogue and doing their own work. The most rewarding thing for me is seeing young people do it better than we ever did, have these incredible ideas, much cooler ideas than we ever had, and putting that work, to good use in their communities as young folks. And that's really, for me at this stage, a big part of what I focus on doing, is trying to support young folks who are doing that work and who deserve to have that process much easier and barrier-free than some of us who are no longer youth had it when we were doing that work.
Excellent. Right. Yes, I have to agree with you. I think in a lot of cases across many issues, it's the ignorance or the lack of understanding that causes people to fear things or be in opposition, right? You, by creating Queer People of Color, Winnipeg, and other such organizations, are going to, create that space to have these dialogues. And like you mentioned, I think it's really important. A lot of people don't have the language. They don't have the words to use to describe particular things or particular feelings. And by creating these spaces, by bringing people who are like-minded, but also people with disparate ideas together, you get to create that language and really dissipate that fear and lack of understanding that really does bring communities together. So again, I commend you on that work. Yeah.
And it's interesting because what I always tell people is, because some folks, it's interesting, during the election, there were some people who were like, you're only going to care about, LGBT people, you're only going to care about Black people. Like, how are you? And I laugh because I'm like, no, I care about all people. It's because I care about all people that I do that work, right? Because I know that foundationally, when we lift the people up who have the hardest time accessing the resources we all deserve, and when we ensure that there are no barriers in the way of anybody accessing the services that they need, when we take care of those in our communities who are most vulnerable, it benefits absolutely everybody. right?
Right.
And so
Right.
I know that people see that. I know that people get that, because when I have that conversation with folks who are learning and unlearning, and then putting that to work in their jobs, you know, around their kitchen, their dinner tables at the holiday season, with that one uncle or grandparent who says that random awful thing, but now you have the language to have that dialogue with them,
Right.
and you know, demand better of them in that way. It benefits everybody. And so I encourage people to think about it that way, right? Like we're
Yes.
talking about building a healthier, well society for everyone, and it requires us finding out who doesn't have that experience and how we can change that for them, with them, alongside them.
Right. Excellent. Again, really good comments. I would argue that, you were talking about your experience on the campaign, and I think it's unfair for people to question whether you would represent the entire community or just particular groups of people, identity groups,
Mm.
because those sort of questions wouldn't be asked of a white
Yeah,
candidate, most likely, right?
absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
again, we see these structural issues all around. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it isn't. But again, I'm glad that you addressed that.
Mhm.
So as we're rounding, we have about 9 minutes left in the program. And again, I have to thank Khalid for coming up with some really great questions. This
Hmm.
is a long type of question, and so it might be the final question of our discussion today. So I'm going to read this to you. So Khalid Nassif again asks, the pandemic demonstrated the weakness of governments in the world in achieving justice and providing
Mhm.
health services and social protections for people.
Mhm.
And this was accompanied by the tightening of the screws on civil society institutions and social movements as well. In your opinion, what are the priorities for working on them in light of the post-pandemic world?
That's just an outstanding question.
Agreed.
Um, you know, I think that actually what this does, it brings me back to my earlier point. The priorities have to be addressing, I mean, let's be honest, right? This pandemic has amplified existing issues. It certainly created, COVID-19 is a novel virus. It's new. We are still learning about it. We've got variants now we're dealing with.
Right.
Now, while the pandemic is a new experience for many, for all of us here, you know, it's the first time in 100 years that we've experienced something like this. Um, while that is new, while the experience of being in quarantine and under these restrictions and talking about community transmission of this thing is new, the issues that we're seeing amplified are not new.
Mhm.
The issues we're seeing amplified are have been persistent, and unfortunately, what we're being faced with, I don't even want to say, I say unfortunately because of the impacts it's having on people,
Sure.
but I also recognize that there's an opportunity and a responsibility
Mm.
to recognize that we have to act quickly to address these disparities. We
Yes.
have to act quickly to address these inequalities and inequities. If we do not, and we're seeing that in this pandemic, it does affect everybody else. I'm not talking about the 1%er of people who are making billions upon billions. I'm not talking about that category of people, but I am talking about the fact that, and a concrete example would be protecting essential workers, right? When we look at, and here in Canada anyway, we can look across jurisdictions and recognize that it is Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color, low-wage workers, folks living in settings with increased numbers of people who don't have the ability to physically distance, people who don't have the luxury of being able to stay home. They have to get on the bus and go to work every single day and work on the front lines without adequate access to PPE, which we all know now is personal protective equipment, like new language for all of us. But these folks not being protected and prioritized will inevitably contribute to community transmission, right? You can't get a virus and community transmission under control if some of the folks who are most disproportionately impacted by the virus don't have the opportunity to stay home and get well, to stay home and stay safe. So to me, that's just one example of how we must address these inequities and protect more vulnerable people in order for our collective society to have the opportunity at being as well as possible. And it's a responsibility that the more people try to avoid it, the more I say we because I'm a legislator now, the more that we don't address it, the longer and more drawn out these issues become, right? They come up in times of crisis. Unfortunately, people pay the price we've seen during this pandemic with their lives, with their livelihood, and that's unacceptable. And so it is by way of policy and legislation that we have to do better. And we have to recognize that if we don't, we must address the root issues if we're ever going to see the outcomes that we need to see all the time, but especially during times of acute crisis.
Okay. Yes, absolutely. Excellent. It's a good way to round out our discussion today. Thanks so much. Really fantastic.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks
Yeah,
everybody for joining.
Certainly. So our audience out there, thank you very much for joining us today. Please put your hands together and thank the member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly in Canada, Uzoma Asagwara, for talking with us today about how self-actualization promotes sustainable development. The Green Institute, I don't know if you noticed, I just put a link in the, I put a link in the chat. Okay, the Green Institute is doing a fundraiser this month at the Global Giving website. So if you could share that with your networks, if you could possibly donate yourself, it'd be really nice. The program that we are trying to sponsor is a program that the director, Dr. Adenike Akinsumulu, has been working on since 2014, called the Girls Sustainability Prize. And what this is what we're doing is we're paying for young girls to attend a private school, as well as be part of a monthly program that introduces them to STEM, a STEM curriculum, being science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this is a project that we're trying to expand through the Green Institute. So if there's any chance that you could spare some of your hard-earned money for that fine charity, that would be fantastic. Please continue to follow the Green Room at the Green HQ on Instagram, Twitter, and the YouTube. And also, please check out our website at www.greeninstitute.ng for programs, book sales, and other information about activities within the Green Institute, as well as with the Green Room and our other programs as well. Again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Uzoma Asagwara, for coming today. And I really do wish you the best of luck with your endeavors, your professional endeavors going forward. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Take care.
Best wishes. Thank you. Take care.